So today we are excited. We're sitting here with Jay Shifman. He's the founder of Choose Your Struggle. His goal is to end the stigma and promote honest and fact-based education around the topics of mental health. He is a survivor of 2 suicide attempts and an overdose, and he is now considered to be in long-term recovery. It's Jay's mission to encourage difficult conversations, honest education. He holds a BA in psychology from Northern Kentucky University, and with over a decade of lived and professional experience in the field, Jay has put numerous hours of independent learning, acquiring certifications in mental health, substance misuse, and addiction. He lives in Philadelphia with his wife, Lauren, and their dog, Nell.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So we're honored to have you. Today's episode is about how we can support the men in our lives, our husbands, our brothers, friends, coworkers. You know, we hear the term mental health, and we really talk about it I think in such a general term. And there's so many areas that I think fall into mental health. I thought today we might focus on some of the more common. And then, of course, talk about how what are some steps we can take to be supporting the men in our lives. So share with us a little bit about yourself, and let's start talking about that.
Well, I appreciate there's 2 things that you really just focused on that we'll distill into one real quick, which is that, in my bio, I say that I like to help people have uncomfortable conversations. And you're right, what you just said, we do talk about mental health a lot, but then when you actually get to the specifics, people are like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. Or no, that feels uncomfortable. I don't want to do that. And in reality, we as a culture are so afraid of being uncomfortable. Perfect example. I just got back from a trip and I sit down on the plane and I'm reading a book and the person next to me is reading a book, and I don't want to get us into the weeds here, but they almost literally were trying to make the exact opposite point. And they looked at me and I looked at them, and they very conspicuously slowly put their headphones in while looking at me. And it was hilarious. It was so funny to me because rather than have a conversation about, wow, this is kind of funny, our books are making opposite points, they were just like, nope. And that is kind of our culture to a T, right? Is that we would rather just say, okay, I'm going to go over here. And sometimes that's fine. But other times when it's literally people's lives at stake, we need to be uncomfortable to just flat out that.
Okay. So with that, you say we need to be uncomfortable. Where are some, I guess maybe share us some examples of how we can change that. Like, for example, on the plane, what could we do differently in that situation? I mean, it's a stranger, so maybe we're not going to necessarily approach it, but when we're sitting with someone that is a family member or a friend, what are some ways that we can be more vulnerable and bring that to the table?
Yeah, so I like the second half better. The plain one, I think, is a funny example, but when it really matters, like when we're sitting with people in our lives that we care about, the rule of thumb that I always try to help people understand with is that, never in the history of ever has forcing somebody to open up to you ever worked. That's just, if you're a parent, that, right? As we were all teens at one time, when our mother or our father got in our face, was like, tell me the truth. The last thing you wanted to do was tell them the truth. So the way that we are trained to have these conversations instead is, with that person in your life that you really love, obviously you do if you want to be sitting there having this conversation with them, is to mirror them what you're hoping to get. So the example I can give is that, nobody is ever not struggling with something, and sit down and say, hey, I know that you're somebody who gives me good advice or is willing to be a empathetic ear. Do you mind if I kind of talk through something I'm struggling with, right? And you do that and you just get nothing in return. I mean, you're not asking for anything from them in return. And you create this sort of 2-way street where that person goes, okay, they trust me enough to ask my opinion. They trust me enough to be that empathetic person. I can be that, or I can look for that in them. Obviously, that's starting way upstream. If you're in a crisis moment, that's not exactly going to work. But if there's somebody in your life you think is struggling with their mental health, that is the best way to start, is by coming to them and just saying, hey, would you mind helping me with something? And creating that opportunity for them to say, I'm also working on something right now.
Would you say that from a male perspective, that is still an appropriate approach. I think in general it probably is, but from the men in our lives, I've witnessed that emotions are held pretty close, and they're not expressed like, most women we kind of wear on our sleeves. And I'll give an example. My husband, it used to be early on after losing our son, him being able to share his emotions was almost impossible. And if we start to have uncomfortable conversations about what we were feeling, he had to literally leave the room. And it's only been in maybe the last year that he has been able to be more present with those emotions. And so I feel like it's almost this learned skill that we have to continue to build this muscle, like you do a muscle. What are your thoughts on that, Jay?
Well, you're 100% right. I mean, we are taught, and I'm a millennial, I'm only 35, but we were all taught, this stupid, outdated, harmful belief of be a man, all this awful stuff, right? And my dad is very loving. He's one of my heroes. He's one of my best friends. But even he used to say that, right? Because that's just what he was taught. So we are unlearning that harmful learned belief. But this does work, and I can give you an example from my own life. So a couple of years ago, I was reading this magazine article in Psychology Today where they were highlighting how it was 95% or so of all male friendships revolve around 3 topics. I've done this multiple times. No one's ever guessed all 3. Do you want to take a shot at it?
Oh, yeah.
Sex,
I would love to take it.
Sex, food.
So sex or women is number 1.
Oh, yeah.
Sports.
Sports is number 2.
3, I would think career.
Nope.
Exercise.
Nope.
Golf.
No, and I don't play golf, so I'm very happy about that one.
Family? Would it be family and dating?
It's media, so music, movies, TV, whatever, right? And this article gave this example because they were interviewing people, and they were telling these crazy stories, like a guy who had been divorced for a decade and none of his friends knew because nobody ever asked, or another guy who was homeless, and again, his friends just never asked him where he lived, and so he didn't tell anybody. So I read that, and it almost literally knocked me out of my chair that I was sitting in, and because it hit too close to home. I had just gotten married, and I realized that of my non-blood relatives who were my groomsmen, that was the relationship I had with too many of those guys. So I reached out to all of them, including my brothers that day, and I said, look, I just read this. It scared me because it was too real. We're going to change this. Yes, we are still going to talk about these topics we love because my buddies and I love to talk about, sports, especially and all that kind of stuff. But we're also going to have deeper conversations. And a friend of mine, one of the guys who I knew probably the least of my groomsmen, we had bonded over a shared obsession with the world of Star Wars. And that's kind of what we talked about about 90% of the time in sports, because he was also a big sports guy. I told him that, and he was a guy who was raised in a very buttoned up household. Well, here, fast forward to 3 years later, he just had his first kid. Congratulations to him. And 2 weeks before he had the kid, we had a long talk about how scared he was and about how he was looking forward to it, of course, but also was absolutely terrified of what if he wasn't going to be a good dad and all this kind of stuff. 3 years ago, we don't have that discussion because he doesn't think that he can trust me that way. And working this relationship to the point where now he's one of my closest friends and he felt comfortable sharing those emotions with me. It meant a lot. And I know it meant a lot to him because clearly he felt that he had somebody he could share these thoughts with. So it does take work. I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, you have this conversation. The next day they're going to turn around. It takes a lot of work. But the caution I would say to people who are like, oh, what if I scare them off? I mean, if you have someone in your life that you love and you want to have that emotional connection with, and they're not willing to do the work, I mean, quite frankly, that's not a relationship that would have lasted the bonds of time anyways. So my caution to you is do the work, put the time in and tell the person that you care about them and you want to have that closer and in reality, more solid relationship.
Jay, you said something in there that you really touched on, the fear of if I open up, is it going to be too much for somebody to really handle. And I think that is it seems to be a common thing for a lot of men. And I love the fact of men showing up for other men, because sometimes opening up to a female, I would say there's kind of a misconception maybe. Well, they're emotional, so it doesn't feel the same as when you can open up to a guy and have a real conversation. I mean, I would think it seems more supportive, and I don't know if that's right or not, but it seems like it's another guy who can relate to what I'm going through.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I could tell you, pick up my phone right now, and there are 10 women that would be here in an instant to listen if I had a struggle, obviously led by my amazing wife. And the list of guys is shorter. I mean, that is a harder relationship to build. But if you are able to, one of my best friends in the world, he's been one of my best friends since we were in middle school. And, we had an issue, this would have been about 6 months ago, that I laid it out how I was feeling, and it caught him off guard because, again, what you're saying, guys don't really do that. We kind of just bottle it up and keep moving. And 10 years later, we're still mad that thing happened, right? And so I let him know. We actually talked about it. We talked about it over wings while watching a football game. And now we are better off because of it. I mean, it definitely, again, to my earlier point, it takes the work. But to your point, once you get there, it really creates. I mean, this was a guy who literally was a brother to me and was still kind of shocked that I would express a way I was feeling, even after being close friends for over 20 years. It's just the way we're taught. But if you can put that work in, it creates a relationship that is so much more fulfilling, would be the word I would choose there.
Okay. So, I'm mostly reflected on my experience with the close men in my life, my 2 boys and my husband. And I think about the different ways that I've witnessed how they power through their emotions. And I heard a term from Brene Brown on a podcast recently where they talked about digging deep, digging in. And that's not really leaning in. That's not allowing for the emotions. And so as I'm thinking about the way my husband copes with stress, or when he feels vulnerable, or he's feeling any type of emotions that are what we label as depression, but not necessarily depression, they're just emotions. His way of coping is, he's going to go skiing. He's going to go on a hike. He's going to go and do something active, where I'm probably going to sit on the couch, curl up and cry, or eat a bowl of ice cream while I watch Netflix. So, and my sons were, not that they were raised to be strong and not have emotion, because I feel like there was somewhat of a balance there, but they tend to hold everything in and not share. And I thought we were creating an environment where you could do that. And so I guess I'm saying, what I'm asking is, as me supporting these men, I felt like I had to really learn to kind of witness what worked for them and how they expressed, and then finding that opportunity to speak about it. And that was challenging, getting them to actually speak about it and finding the right time.
Well, I will say my caveat here is that, Cristie, your way of dealing with this sounds exactly what I would do as well. That I was brought up in a family where my mother was more the stoic one and my dad was more the emotional one, and so I sort of had the flip of these gender norms showed to me, and so that is my go-to. And my wife knows that I don't keep things bottled up well. I just don't. I share my feelings readily, and I think it's actually made our marriage stronger because she doesn't worry about me bottling up some thing that I'm angry. I'll tell her. But I will say that there is an exercise I was taught a long time ago by a therapist that I absolutely love, that I recommend to everybody. And it's called the daily check-in. And it's great for men and women because it's very private. And if you can get over the fear, which is the number one emotion that this can invoke, it can be a really helpful emotion, or a really helpful exercise. And this is very simple, so I can tell it to you very quickly here. It is an exercise of mindfulness where you pull out your phone or a notepad or whatever it is that you want to use to write on, and you write the words "I feel," and then you finish the sentence. And you do this over and over again until you feel empty. And when you first start, when you're holding back a little bit, this is going to be very surface level. I feel angry that this happened. I feel hungry, or whatever the case is. But the more you work on it, the more you start breaking this barrier between your conscious and your subconscious emotions in your mind here. And what starts coming up are the things that, as this therapist shared with me, he was like, man, I wish these were the things that my clients would bring in every day. Not that these sort of BS surface level fights with their sister or whatever aren't important. Like, yes, let's work on that. But those deep seated things that you don't even know are there until you start doing this work, that's the kind of life-changing stuff that a good therapist is going to help you move past. And the analogy that he used, that I still love to use to this day, is that your mind is like a garden, and what is going on in your consciousness is just over the soil, right? You're seeing the flowers and the weeds grow, but that doesn't really tell you what's happening underneath the surface. You got to get down there, get your hands dirty and pull those roots or the weeds up by the root. And this exercise helps you realize what's down there underneath the surface. And that's then the first step to working on it. So I definitely understand the reluctance from people to do this, because sometimes what comes up will terrify you. I know, I've been there. But carrying it around does nothing for you. You just have to get down there, get your hands dirty, and then start working on it.
Oh, I love that you said that. And I have to say, I'm fortunate in that my husband he's the opposite. He talks about everything, yeah, which I appreciate, because good communication is key, right? And so he's not afraid to talk about emotions. He's that guy friend that he can ask other guys, like, how you doing, man? Which I love. But also my son, who was diagnosed with ADHD, and I know you talk about this. I'm grateful that he talks about his emotions, and he definitely shows his emotions, but he's also that friend to other people, but he carries still a lot within himself, and trying to hold space for him that it's okay. And he's now married, and his wife is more the stoic one, so what you were saying is, so how do we, if men are scared to open up, if men are, I'm kind of going all over the place, but I do want to dive into the ADHD a little bit and the medications. But how, as a mom, as a partner, if you are with someone who it's just hard to get them to open up. And I think sometimes we can be really critical and judgmental. And so I know there's a piece of that where we need to step back and go, okay, if I'm going to hold space for this person and allow them to open up, I need to not get reactive. And how can I be supportive? What is the best advice there to even start that? Because sometimes we just have knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah, and that's very human, obviously. The thing I think that is really important to remember is that you can't be that for everybody, right? I know my mother, I love her very much. I respect her. We don't have that relationship because she is the more stoic one, that I, quite frankly, don't open up to my mother the way that I do to my dad, because he is more the emotional one and understands more what's going on inside of me. So in that case, is it possible that my mother and I could develop that relationship this late in life? Of course it's possible. But she would have to, at the very beginning, set aside this idea that she doesn't know best, right? I mean, she literally does not feel what I am feeling. And so in that case, she would have to start there and say, I know that I don't understand. And that's really hard for a lot of us to say, especially if, like my mother, you are more of the stoic and unemotional person in this give and take here. So that would be the place to start, is by saying, I recognize that I do not know. And that's, when we're taught to try to understand other people, right? That's literally step one for a lot of these things, is to say, I don't know what you're going through, and I recognize that. Please help me understand. Because, as someone who's lived through, let's say my experience of addiction, when people come in and go, oh, I get it, because I've read the news or I've heard whatever, that is an immediate shutdown. Like, you do not understand. And also, quite frankly, the way that people like me, my story has been reported, is flat out wrong. And there's a lot of baggage there. So when people sit down and say, man, I would love to understand more, and first step is, I know I don't know, that makes me want to open up and go, oh, wow, like, thank you for that. Sure, I would love to help you understand a little bit better.
You know what? I really appreciate that, because you're so spot on. And I think when our kids are younger, we try to control so much. Cristie and I have been talking about control. But now that he's older, it's so much easier for me to step back and actually say, you know what? I really don't understand what you're going through, but I still want to be the person that's here for you to support you. And I may not understand it. And I think a lot of times, if you can't be that place for somebody, that person for somebody, it's okay for somebody else. So I appreciate you saying that. It's okay for somebody else to fill that spot.
Well, and if we are, that person for someone that is, you gave the example as your mother, but I'm sure there's so many of us out there that we may not make it easy for the men to come to us.
For sure.
So, excuse me. So having some self-awareness around how you handle tough situations or tough conversations is important to ask yourself. I can, give an example looking back at just all of my children collectively, but mostly my son, who we talked about, that I lost to suicide. And, I didn't understand what his emotions were, how much they were building, and how much he was not sharing. He was giving surface level communication, but what was really happening is when he was sharing, because I was so disconnected from depression and what that looked like, I was trying to fix it. I was trying to rationalize and say, I would make responses like, well, I don't understand. You have all of these friends, you have this beautiful family, you have a car to get to your hockey games. Like, why? And that was my ignorant, naive side at the time. And so I encourage, when I'm talking to people today, to be able to listen without the judgment. And while you're holding space, it's an effort to just literally not speak and just be able to absorb what they're sharing. And instead of trying to fix it, ask the questions of how that makes them feel. What are your thoughts on that, Jay?
I want to say that I identify with that so much because, like you, I come from I think this is my mother's side of me, is that I am a problem solver who wants to think of things rationally. And as a guy with OCD, when things don't behave in a rational way, my brain feels like it's on fire, and I need things to be orderly. And so that is the one thing that I would say the biggest thing I fall short of in being a good husband to my wife is that sometimes I just want to fix things, and she has to say, I don't want you to fix this. I just want you to listen. And I struggle with that like a lot of people. So I definitely underscore that. But to your earlier point, you made just something that I wish every person, not just mother or father or whatever, would understand, is that they have to, to properly help the people in their life, sometimes they have to remove their personal connection to the situation. I have an extreme story I love to tell because I think it's so helpful. I was working with a client. This was over 2 years ago. And the family had hired me because the guy was 21 or so and was really struggling with substance misuse and addiction. He had just overdosed and lived, thank God. And that's when they hired me. And that's when a lot of people, I don't do a lot of coaching anymore, but I always say yes to that situation. If you've just survived an overdose, like I'm here as a survivor myself. And they were telling me this whole story, and it really wasn't adding up. So I sit down with the young guy, and he's telling me this story, and it's very sad, but it's almost typical. He had been struggling. He got into recovery. He was on buprenorphine, which is the drug that really helps people with opioid addictions, get better. And one day he was at work, and his mom was cleaning his room. Very nice thing for her to do. and she moved his dresser and found a needle. Now, this needle was probably years old at this point. The kid didn't even know it was there. The mother decided this meant that he had relapsed, calls him, demands he come home from work so she can kick him out of the house. And he leaves. And unfortunately, in those moments of high stress, when you were like this young man was, I mean, he was less than a month into recovery. What are you going to do? You're going to go to the thing that made you feel better. So he goes and buys heroin, and his dealer wasn't around. So he buys from the first person he can find. So he doesn't know the purity of the drug. He doesn't know the dose, and he overdoses. And the mom just could not hear her role in this, right? She knew the books say you know, tough love and all that harmful stuff. And so after hearing both of them tell this story, I had to help the mom understand, like, I know you thought you were doing the thing that was best for your son in that moment, but you unintentionally were what drove him to use in this moment. And thank God he lived through his overdose. So it's really hard in those moments to step back. And again, actually, to use a quote that she said when she hired me, she said, "Jay, it's almost like he doesn't care what I want." And I had to say, I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this. He doesn't. He's struggling with addiction. That overwhelms everything else. I know, I've been there. You have to remove your connection to this person as mother to son and just say, how is this human suffering, and how can I play a role in them getting better? And that's not easy. I'm not going to say it is. But in that moment, she could not see anything other than from her own, direct line of vision there. And it almost was fatal for her son.
We have a hard time. We have a hard time separating that. And we think that it's about us.
Yep.
And that's where I think we can fall short if we can't have some awareness around that and just take a minute and make it about the person that we're talking
For
to.
sure. Well, and Jay, I wanted to ask you, kind of shifting gears just a little bit. So we do have a small percentage, but we have a small percentage of men that listen to our podcast who are fathers, sons, brothers. What is one piece of advice you would give them if, well, it's not if, like you said earlier at the beginning of the show, we all have struggles at some point, right? I mean, it's just life. It's hyped now. I mean, sensitive right now, but what would you say to any of our male listeners out there who have a hard time communicating and opening up? What's the first step for them outside of, I love your practice of, I feel, that's awesome. Outside of that.
Well, first off, hello, fellow men. Good to talk to you. So let me actually give an example from my childhood growing up. As I said, I wear my heart on my sleeve kind of guy, but I'm the oldest of four boys in a crazy household. There wasn't a lot of one-on-one time with my parents, but there was one moment where we always knew we could talk to my dad, and that was when we were playing catch in the front yard. He's a big baseball guy. I played baseball, organized ball for about 15 years. Multiple of my brothers did as well. And that was our one-on-one time, was with the two of us in the front yard playing catch. And inevitably, my dad would always, hey, what's going on? Let's talk. And as we're adults now, I was just in Florida with him for a couple of days, and we went to dinner and we had a great conversation, but we also had a catch and caught up. And, the advice I would say is find that activity with this person, whether it's your son, your daughter, your spouse, that you feel comfortable in that moment being more vulnerable. Some people can feel super awkward sitting there at the dinner table trying to have hard conversations. I get it. For me and my wife, that's usually just a nice time to put on some music and have a meal together. So I don't really want to be super open and vulnerable in that moment. But there are other times when, whether maybe it's you're taking a walk, or maybe it's you're driving, and so not only are you stuck in this position where there's nothing, you can't go anywhere, but you're also forced to face forward, so you don't have to look at the person. That can be a really helpful moment to have these hard conversations. Maybe it's taking a walk, whatever it is that you do. Maybe you guys, go boating together. I don't know, but figure out that moment where you feel comfortable, and then just start opening slowly. And the moment can be super helpful. And, as I said, I look back fondly on those moments where, yes, could it have been annoying that my dad always wanted to talk about stuff when I was trying to work on, I was a pitcher for a while, so I was trying to work on my latest pitch, but sure. But I also understood that this was our time. This was our time to talk and have a more of a connection when it was really hard to find those moments.
I love that. And I wanted to ask you also, Jay, I kind of touched on it earlier. Your work as far as how we're dealing as a society with ADHD and all of the, there's a lot going on right now, but what's your latest response on all of that and how we're dealing with this?
Yeah. So a little bit of context for those listening who are like, why does she keep asking about ADHD?
Sorry.
No, it's important. So that's a big part of my story. I was diagnosed in the late 90s as a preteen. And for a little bit of context on that, in the mid 80s when I was born, there were only roughly, I think it's about 350,000 young people treated for that umbrella of disorders, what we call ADHD, in the United States. And by the time I was diagnosed, it was over 2 million. We're now at over 4.5 million. This has just exploded. And the easy thing to say is, well, of course, it's overprescribed, which I agree with. I think that for some people, these are super necessary diagnoses and prescriptions. But for other people, it's just that, trying to make a 10-year-old sit through a very antiquated education format where you're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to move, you just have to focus, is really hard for a lot of people. I would struggle with that today as a 35-year-old. I need breaks. I know what my attention is. So I do think it's over prescribed, but that doesn't mean that attention is not something that we as a society are struggling with. I just checked out Johan Hari's new book, which is all about the attention. I'm a big Johan Hari fan. If you have not read Chasing the Scream about the war on drugs, I think it's incredible. It's a really tough one because unfortunately I don't have a good answer. I know that the story I can tell is a couple of years ago, a good friend of mine who had at the time a 7-year-old asked me out to lunch, and we sat down, and he said, look, I know your story. They're trying to put my 7-year-old on Ritalin. And I was like, man, that's tough. I'm not a dad. I don't have kids. I can't imagine putting my young child on drugs. That is pretty amazing. But at the same time, not everybody's able to give their kid the focus that my friend was. And so I said, if I could give you a piece of advice, it would be to actually talk to your child and figure out, is there another school you can go to with more free time? Is there more, can you build in more exercise in the day to help him get rid of some of that energy? And he considered all the options and ended up moving in schools. He is not treated for it to this day. He has been, Wow. He went somewhere where they gave him more attention. He got more recess, and he's fine. That's not to say that he doesn't have attention issues, but it is to say that he didn't need Ritalin at 7 years old.
Needed to change his environment.
Yes. And I appreciate you sharing that. I think this ties into mental health. I don't know if you've read the book. I have a grandson who is 6, who is autistic. And there's a book out there, The Myth of Autism, and it's by Dr. Michael Goldberg, I believe is the author. It's a fascinating book, but he dives into how we don't look at the brain, but he got into everything as far as ADHD, and we just have a tendency to throw medication at stuff, and we're not dealing with the actual problem. So anyway, I find that fascinating, but it is really all about our mental health. Also, Jay, to tie into that, I'm just curious your thoughts real quick on, there's a lot of talk now about social media and how we're being controlled and what is happening as far as Google, it's all the social media apps, and how we now are a generation, you're kind of on that cusp. So I have a daughter who's 32, and, technology wasn't like it is now. So you're actually ahead of them in the sense of they didn't have smartphones at a young age. They didn't have all this stuff that's being fed. And there's this whole generation. And And it really is, we've had COVID, we've had all these things, but people are paying more attention to mental health, but to your point at the beginning, but are we really diving in? Do you have any thoughts on that, on how we can help our younger generation coming in, addressing all of those issues?
Yeah. So sort of two answers there. The first is that, I was really actually fascinated by this question of, is social media, we kind of been up in arms about, is social media ruining the brains of young kids, all that kind of stuff. So I went back, I found this amazing article not long ago. It really set me off on this. And they were highlighting how when you went back to the invention of the telephone, we had very similar takes. And they use that as an example to show that, like, throughout history, there's always been this worry, and the sad but accurate answer is we don't really know for a long time afterwards. And so I'm always hesitant to give my take on things like social media because I don't want to be featured in articles like that in 20 years. Where, look at this, what this guy said about social,
Yeah.
I think there are goods and there's good part of it where, people find. My favorite story is the guy who, when it was, people were talking about how negative social media was. He said, look, I was a gay teen growing up in Mississippi. There was nobody around me that I could talk to, and I found my community online. So those moments, it's easy to say, of course, there's positives of social media. Now, on the flip side, I would say that the one thing we really need to be doing that we're not doing enough is listening to this generation. I'm not really on TikTok. I have a TikTok, but I don't really like TikTok. That's an embarrassing thing to admit as a millennial. I'm so sorry, fellow millennials. But I know my friends who are super enthusiastic about the next generation because they're sharing these emotions in a way that we did not do growing up. They're willing to talk about things in a way that the level of acceptance of other people is through the roof. And those are the things that make me, that give me hope, is that if this is what this generation is coming up, is it going to be perfect? Of course not. But every generation, we're getting a little bit more accepting of other people and of sharing ourselves with other people. And that gives me some hope for the future.
I think that's a great message. Okay, Jay, talk to us as we wrap this up about Choose Your Struggle. Tell us about that. Your company.
So, yeah. So it came from sharing my story for the first time in 2015. Which the very short version here is that I am a survivor of multiple suicide attempts and an overdose. I am over 12 years in recovery now, but I'm not sober, which is roughly a quarter of the recovery community is people like myself who are in recovery from a certain struggle, but are not completely stone cold sober. And I told my story on stage for the first time in 2015. And it really just set me off on this path that now I do this for a living. I speak. I have a book coming out. I have multiple podcasts that all of my company, that the goal is to end stigma and promote honest and fact-based education around mental health, substance misuse and recovery, and drug use and policy. Because unfortunately, as we've really spent a lot of time talking about mental health here, and it's the same with drug use and addiction. A lot of what we've been taught for a long time is both unintentionally and intentionally wrong. And these stories go back over 100 years. I gave a TED talk on this almost a year ago now that really tried to show how the very first anti-drug laws in this country that set the foundation for that created this crisis that we're in today. I mean, it's just grown from there. And most of it, in fact, over 90% of these laws are not based in science. They're not based in fact. A lot of them are based in outdated beliefs about even about the human brain, things that we would laugh at now. This is where a lot of our policies come from when it comes to mental health and addiction. So I think, sort of going to something we were saying earlier, the first step with all of this is being willing to say, I may not know best here. I may, like most people, have been taught things that were incorrect, and I need to be open-minded and willing to learn. As someone who does this for a living, I know I learn something new literally every day. And so when people tell me that, no, I know whatever about drug use or mental health, that's really hard to have a conversation after that, because I don't want to be the one to tell you flat out that you are wrong, but I will, because these topics are too important for us not to have those conversations.
Oh, that's so important. Well, and before we always ask our guests, so before we let you go, we have one more question for you, Jay. If you could go back and tell your 19-year-old self something, what would that be?
Oh, that's a tough question. People in the past have asked me, would you tell yourself it will get better? Sure. Yes. But my 19-year-old self probably wouldn't have believed that. I would say that the most important message I wish I would have told my 19-year-old self is to reach out to somebody. After I attempted suicide, I had so many people in my life who were like downright angry at me. They were hurt, they were scared, and they were angry because they were like, how dare you not tell me? Like, these were people who consider themselves my close friends. And I didn't tell, most of them, of course. And I wish depression can be very isolating, and it can convince you that you are alone, even when there are people around you who care about you very deeply. And I didn't know better at that time to not listen to that little voice in my head. So it would probably be that, like, reach out. There are people who care.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Well, Jay, thank you so much for being here with us today. This is so important. I want everyone to know you can find Jay at jshifman.com. He's got a powerful website with a ton of information. Anything else you want to say, Cristie?
Tell us the name of your book, Jay.
Yes.
It's still in drafts.
Okay.
I don't have but I will say, if I got a second to plug one more thing, I do have a new show coming out in a couple of weeks called Choose Your Struggle Presents Made It Season 1 Stay Savage. It's a documentary podcast on a person like me who found her way back from trauma to create something beautiful, in this case, a nonprofit organization here in Philly called Stay Savage. It's a really difficult story to hear, but a really important one.
Oh, I love it. Thank you for sharing that, Jay. Till next time.